Come on, broke loser. At least pretend you're happy for me. My brother Marcus said this across the dinner table at our parents' house, loud enough that everyone heard, his fiancée Ashley giggling beside him while Mom and Dad exchanged uncomfortable glances, but said nothing, which was somehow worse than if they'd laughed along. I had congratulated him on his engagement exactly 4 minutes earlier, genuinely, with real warmth in my voice. But apparently my face hadn't arranged itself into sufficiently enthusiastic approval, and Marcus had never been one to let my perceived failures slide without comment. This was 3 weeks ago, and I was 28 years old, sitting in the same chair I'd occupied at family dinners my entire life, wearing a sweater I'd bought on sale because that's what they expected from me. Listening to my older brother call me a broke loser for the 11th time that year. I'd started counting in January. Marcus was 32, a corporate finance manager at a mid-sized firm in downtown Chicago, the kind of job that came with a title that impressed our parents and quarterly bonuses he mentioned frequently, and he was engaged to Ashley, whose family had money, the kind of money that made my parents speak more carefully and sit up straighter when her parents were around. I was Emma, the younger sister, the one who does some computer stuff, as Dad described my work to relatives, dismissing the freelance graphic design business I'd built over 6 years as if it were a hobby I'd grow out of once I found real employment. I lived in a modest one-bedroom apartment in a decent neighborhood, nothing fancy, drove a 7-year-old Honda Civic that ran perfectly well, despite Marcus's comments about maybe it was time to upgrade to something less embarrassing. And I dressed simply because I worked from home and saw no point in spending money on clothes that would impress people whose opinions shouldn't matter to me anyway. Though of course they did, because these were my parents. This was my brother. This was my family. Emma's doing fine, Mom had said that night. Not exactly a ringing endorsement, more like the kind of thing you say about a child who's trying their best but not quite succeeding. And then she'd changed the subject back to the wedding plans, asking Ashley about the venue they'd chosen, the 400-person guest list, the destination honeymoon to the Maldives that Marcus kept describing in elaborate detail. The engagement party was coming up in 2 weeks, Marcus had announced, his hand covering Ashley's on the table in that possessive way that probably looked romantic to them but just seemed performative to me. And of course I was expected to attend. Expected to smile and celebrate and watch my parents beam with pride at their successful son while I stood in corners wondering when exactly I'd accepted the role of family disappointment. "You'll be there, right, Emma?" Marcus had asked, and it wasn't really a question, it was a requirement wrapped in polite words, the kind of demand that came with unspoken consequences if I refused. I'd nodded, said of course, "Congratulations again," and watched his expression shift to satisfaction, the look of someone who'd secured compliance and could now move on to more important topics. What Marcus didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had $11,000 sitting in my checking account at that moment. Not to mention the savings and investment accounts I never mentioned, the business that had quietly grown beyond anything they'd bothered to ask about, the success I'd learned to hide because every time I'd tried to share an achievement, it had been minimized or ignored or somehow turned into evidence that I still wasn't doing as well as Marcus. I drove home that night in my embarrassing Honda, let myself into my modest apartment, and sat on my couch wondering how much longer I could keep living this double life where my family believed I was barely scraping by while I was actually doing better than any of them suspected. The pattern started long before that dinner, woven into the fabric of my childhood so thoroughly that I didn't recognize it as abnormal until I was much older, didn't have the words to describe what was happening until therapy gave me the vocabulary to understand that favoritism wasn't just preference, but a form of erosion that wore away at the less favored child's sense of worth. I remembered Marcus's high school graduation, remembered how he'd barely passed his classes, how Dad had still stood up at the family dinner afterward and given this speech about his son's bright future, about how proud he was, while Mom dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. And 4 years later, when I graduated from the same high school with a 3.9 GPA and acceptance letters from 6 universities, including 2 with substantial scholarships. The family dinner had been quieter, more subdued. Dad saying he was proud but not standing up, not giving speeches. Mom asking practical questions about student loans and whether I was sure about majoring in art. I'd won a regional art competition my junior year, a scholarship worth $1,500 and recognition in the local paper. And Mom had clipped the article and put it on the refrigerator for 3 days before replacing it with Marcus's company softball league schedule. And when I'd pointed out that my article was gone, she'd looked confused, said she thought I'd taken it for my portfolio, said the fridge was getting too cluttered anyway. College had been 4 years of similar patterns, me making Dean's List every semester while Marcus scraped by with C's and D's at a state school 2 hours away. Yet our parents drove up for his games, his parties, his random weekends when he wanted to do laundry at their house, while my academic achievements were acknowledged with phone calls that lasted 5 minutes before Mom needed to go because she had something on the stove or Dad was calling her or they had plans they'd forgotten about. I graduated summa cum laude with a degree in graphic design and a minor in business. Had 3 job offers before graduation, chose to go freelance because I'd already built a client base through college work and could see the potential for growth. And at my graduation party, small and quick because Mom said she was tired from Marcus's graduation party the week before, Dad had spent 20 minutes talking to relatives about Marcus's new job in finance, how he was climbing the corporate ladder, how proud they were that he'd found such a solid career path. And when Aunt Claire had asked about my plans, Dad had said I was going to do some design work, try the freelance thing for a while, see how it went, his tone suggesting it was a phase I'd outgrow once reality set in. The engagement party was in 9 days, and I was dreading it the way you dread dental procedures or tax audits, necessary but painful, something to endure rather than experience. Mom called 6 days before the party, her voice bright with the artificial cheer she used when she was about to ask me to do something I wouldn't want to do, and she said, "Emma, honey, you're coming to Marcus's party, right?" As if there had been any question, as if I had the option to decline without causing a family crisis that would somehow be positioned as my fault, my selfishness, my inability to be happy for my brother. "Of course," I said, sitting at my desk where I'd been working on a logo design for a tech startup that was paying me $8,000 for the project, and Mom said, "Good, that's good. Wear something nice. Ashley's family will be there, and they're lovely people. Very successful." The implication being that I should try not to embarrass the family with my broke loser aesthetic, though she didn't say that part out loud, didn't need to, because I'd learned to hear the subtext in every conversation with my parents. Learn to translate their careful words into their actual meanings. The engagement party was at Luminaire, one of those downtown Chicago venues with floor-to-ceiling windows and crystal chandeliers, and a price tag that made my stomach clench when I looked it up online the night before. The kind of place that required valet parking and had a dress code and made me feel like an imposter the moment I walked through the heavy glass doors into the marble-floored lobby, where a hostess in all black directed me toward the private event space on the 3rd floor. I'd worn a simple navy dress, knee-length, nothing fancy, paired with flats, because I'd never mastered walking in heels and saw no reason to torture myself for Marcus's benefit. But the moment I stepped into the party space and saw the other guests, I knew I'd miscalculated, knew I was underdressed in a room full of cocktail dresses and designer labels and jewelry that caught the light from those chandeliers and threw it back in brilliant fragments. Ashley's family was there, her parents and 2 brothers, and what looked like an aunt and uncle. All of them dressed like they'd come from a country club, which they probably had, and they stood in a cluster near the bar talking with my parents, who I could see were trying very hard to appear comfortable, to project an image of belonging in this space with these people. Dad's laugh slightly too loud, Mom's posture rigid with the effort of making a good impression. Marcus stood at the center of the room like a sun around which everyone else orbited, his arm around Ashley's waist, his voice carrying across the space as he told some story that had a group of his friends laughing. And he looked happy, genuinely happy in a way I rarely saw, and I felt a pang of something that might have been affection or might have been grief for the relationship we'd never had. The brother who might have protected me instead of diminishing me. The family dynamic that could have been different if anyone had bothered to make it so. I made my way toward the bar, intending to get a drink and find a corner where I could blend into the background, but Mom spotted me and waved me over with that urgent gesture that meant I was required immediately, and I changed direction, weaving through clusters of guests who didn't know me and didn't look particularly interested in changing that, until I reached the group where my parents stood with Ashley's parents, whose names I'd been told but immediately forgotten. "This is Emma, our daughter," Dad said, his tone pleasant but somehow diminishing, as if he were introducing a minor character who wouldn't be important to the plot, and Mom added, "She does some computer stuff, graphic design, works from home," with that same apologetic quality she always used when describing my career, as if she were explaining a disability or an unfortunate life choice I'd made, despite their best efforts to guide me towards something more respectable. Ashley's mother, a woman with perfectly highlighted blonde hair and the kind of thin frame that spoke of dedicated personal training and careful eating, smiled politely and said, "How nice," in a tone that suggested it was anything but nice, that working from home in pajamas doing computer stuff was perhaps one step above unemployment, and her husband, thick-necked and red-faced in the way of men who played golf and ate steak and measured their worth in stock portfolios, nodded and immediately turned back to Dad to continue whatever conversation I'd interrupted. I stood there for 30 awkward seconds, invisible despite being physically present, before extracting myself and finally making it to the bar, where I ordered a gin and tonic I didn't particularly want, but needed something to do with my hands, something to justify my presence in this space where I clearly didn't belong. And when I turned around, drink in hand, I saw Marcus watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between pity and contempt, and he raised his glass in a mock toast before turning away to greet more arriving guests. And I realized with sudden clarity that I was here not as a cherished family member, but as an obligation fulfilled, a box checked, the disappointing younger sister, whose presence was required for appearance's sake, but whose absence would have been preferred. I found a spot near one of those floor-to-ceiling windows where I could stand without being completely in the way, where I could sip my gin and tonic and watch the party unfold around me like a play I was observing rather than participating in. And for about 20 minutes, I was blessedly ignored, invisible in the way I'd learned to be at family gatherings, present but not present, there but not there, until Marcus's voice cut through the ambient conversation with that caring quality he had when he wanted everyone to hear what he was saying, when he was performing rather than simply talking. $15,000, he said, loud enough that half the room could hear, and I saw heads turn toward him, saw the little circle of guests around him grow larger as people migrated toward the sound of his voice, like he was holding court. "That's what it costs for a proper honeymoon these days, can you believe it? Ashley found this resort in the Maldives, overwater bungalows, private beach, the whole thing, and I'm like, babe, we could go to Cancun for a third of that, but she shows me the pictures and I get it, you know? You only get married once, might as well do it right." Ashley beamed beside him, her left hand positioned so the engagement ring caught the light, and she said something I couldn't quite hear that made the women around her laugh and nod knowingly. And Marcus continued, "The flights alone are $3,500 each, and that's economy. And Ashley's like, we are not flying economy for 14 hours, so that's another $3,000 right there. And then the resort is $2,000 a night, and we're staying for 5 nights, so you do the math. It adds up fast." I watched this performance from my spot by the window, watched how he was simultaneously complaining about the cost and bragging about it, how he was positioning himself as both the put-upon groom dealing with his bride's expensive tastes and the successful man who could afford such extravagance, and I felt that familiar mixture of irritation and something sadder, something like mourning for the brother who might have been different, who might have been kind. I turned back to the window, looking out at the Chicago skyline as the sun set behind the buildings, and I heard Mom's voice joining Marcus's conversation, heard her say, "Well, We told you we'd help, sweetheart. We have the 4,000 we promised you. And Marcus saying, I know, Mom, and that helps, it really does. Dad, too. You guys are amazing. And then there was some shuffling, some movement, and I felt a presence behind me before I heard Dad's voice saying, Emma, come over here for a minute, in that tone that meant it wasn't really a request. I turned to find Dad and Mom standing with Marcus, the three of them forming a little united front, and other guests were still milling around, but I could feel attention on us, could sense people watching even as they pretended not to. And Marcus had that smile on his face that I'd learned long ago meant he wanted something, that particular expression of calculated charm he used when he was about to ask for a favor he knew you didn't want to grant. So Emma, Marcus said, his arm draped casually around my shoulders in a gesture of brotherly affection that we both knew was performance, was for the benefit of anyone watching. Family should support family, right? That's what family does. We support each other during big life moments. I felt something tighten in my chest, that anticipatory dread that comes when you know something bad is approaching, but you can't yet see its full shape, can't yet understand the scope of what's being asked of you. Of course, I said carefully, and Marcus squeezed my shoulder and said, That's what I told Ashley. I said my little sister might not have much, but she's got a good heart. She'd want to help out if she could. And I heard the trap in those words, heard how he was already framing my inevitable refusal as a moral failing, as a lack of generosity rather than a lack of means. And Mom was nodding encouragingly, and Dad was looking at me with that expression of expectation he'd worn my whole life, the look that said I was about to disappoint him, but he'd learned to expect that from me. Marcus's smile widened, and he said the words I'd been dreading since the moment he'd pulled me into this little family huddle, said them casually, like he was asking to borrow $20 instead of demanding a sum that would have represented months of savings if I'd actually been the person he thought I was. So here's the thing, Em. We're still about 6,500 short for the honeymoon, and I was thinking, you're my sister, and this is a once-in-a-lifetime thing, and it would mean a lot to Ashley and me if you could contribute that amount, help us make this dream trip happen. The number hit me like a physical blow. $6,500, more than 4 months of rent on my apartment, more than most people had in their savings accounts, and he was asking for it like it was nothing, like it was a reasonable request to make of someone he'd spent years calling a broke loser, someone whose career he'd dismissed as a hobby, someone he'd never once asked about or shown interest in or treated with basic respect. I felt my mouth open, felt myself starting to form the words to say I couldn't, that I didn't have that kind of money. But before I could speak, Marcus continued. I mean, it's not like you have anything else to spend money on, right? No wedding to save for, no kids, you live in that little apartment, drive that old Honda. You don't exactly have a lot of expenses, and this would be a way to be part of something important, you know? To actually contribute to the family in a meaningful way. Mom nodded encouragingly, her hand on my arm, and Dad said, It would be a generous thing to do, Emma. Help your brother start his marriage off right. And I felt the walls closing in, felt the weight of their expectation and judgment, and the assumption that I owed Marcus this, owed him my money and my support despite years of his cruelty, and I tried again. Marcus, I really don't think I can afford. But he laughed, actually laughed, and said loud enough that the people standing near us turned to look, loud enough that I saw Ashley's mother glance our way with interest. Come on, broke loser. You can spare some of your little computer money. I'm not asking you to give up your life savings here, just $6,500. You probably spend that much on art supplies or whatever it is you buy. Ashley had drifted closer, drawn by the sound of Marcus's voice, and she giggled at his joke, her hand covering her mouth, but her eyes bright with amusement, and I felt heat rise to my face, felt the familiar shame of being mocked, of being made small in front of people who already thought I was less than. And Mom was still looking at me with that expectant expression, and she said quietly, It would be nice, Emma, to do this for your brother. He's always been there for you. Which was such a blatant rewriting of history that I almost laughed, Except nothing about this moment was funny. Nothing about standing here being publicly pressured to hand over thousands of dollars to someone who treated me like garbage was remotely amusing. I swallowed hard, felt my throat tight with unshed tears, and managed to say, "I need to think about it," which was the best I could do. The only response I could formulate that didn't involve either crying or screaming. And Marcus's face shifted from amusement to irritation, and he said, "Think about what? Either you care about family or you don't. Either you want to support us or you're going to be selfish about it." And he dropped his arm from my shoulders, stepped back like I'd contaminated him with my hesitation, and said, "Whatever, Emma. Just let me know when you decide to stop being so self-centered." And then he turned back to Ashley and his friends, dismissing me completely, and Mom and Dad drifted away looking disappointed, and I stood there alone near the window feeling like I'd been slapped, feeling humiliated and angry and trapped. And I realized I couldn't stay here another minute, couldn't stand in this room full of people who'd just witnessed my brother call me a broke loser and demand money from me in the same breath. So I set my half-finished gin and tonic on the nearest table and walked toward the exit, keeping my head down, and I made it to the elevator and down to the lobby and out to the parking garage where I'd left my old Honda. And only when I was safely inside with the doors locked did I let myself cry. Sitting in the driver's seat with my hands shaking on the steering wheel, tears running down my face as I processed what had just happened. How Marcus had publicly humiliated me while demanding thousands of dollars. How my parents had stood there nodding along like it was perfectly reasonable. How Ashley had giggled at my expense. And I realized with painful clarity that this was who they were, who they'd always been, and nothing I did would ever change that, would ever make them see me as anything other than the family disappointment whose purpose was to serve their needs while accepting their contempt. I drove home on autopilot, barely registering the familiar route back to my apartment in Lincoln Park, the modest one-bedroom place that Marcus had once described as cute, like a college dorm for adults who never quite made it. And by the time I pulled into my assigned parking spot behind the building, the tears had stopped, but my hands were still shaking, and I sat there in the silence for a long moment, before finally gathering my purse and heading upstairs, unlocking the door to find my apartment exactly as I'd left it 2 hours earlier, back when I'd still believed I could get through that party with my dignity intact. I dropped my purse on the kitchen counter and walked to the window that looked out over the street below, the same window where I'd stood countless evenings watching the city move around me while I worked on designs late into the night. And I stood there now, trying to process what had just happened, trying to understand how Marcus could demand $6,500 from someone he genuinely believed was struggling financially, how my parents could stand beside him, nodding encouragingly while he publicly mocked me. And the more I thought about it, the more I felt something shift inside me, some fundamental understanding of who we were to each other, clicking into a new and painful alignment. The truth was that I could have written that check without even noticing the dent in my bank account. Could have handed Marcus $6,500 the way someone else might hand over $65, because my freelance graphic design business, that they all dismissed as computer stuff or a little hobby, was actually thriving in ways I'd never told them about, had never even hinted at, because some deep instinct for self-preservation had told me years ago that my success needed to be kept secret from people who'd spent my entire life making me feel less than. I walked to my desk and opened my laptop, pulled up the banking app I'd checked just that morning, and looked at the numbers that told the real story of my life, the one my family knew nothing about. $183,412 in my combined savings and investment accounts, the result of 5 years of building a client base that paid premium rates for premium work, of living below my means, not because I had to, but because I'd grown up watching my parents stress over money, and I'd vowed never to feel that precarious uncertainty myself. My business checking account showed another $42,000, and the income deposits from the past 3 months told their own story. $12,000 in January, $15,000 in February, $13,500 in March because I'd recently secured 3 major corporate clients who needed ongoing branding work, companies whose names my parents would recognize if I ever told them, which I never had because the one time I'd tried to share a professional success, Marcus had said, "Oh, everyone knows someone who does graphic design. It's not exactly rare." And Mom had changed the subject to ask if I was dating anyone. I'd bought an investment property last year, a small condo in Wicker Park that I rented out for $1,800 a month, and my parents didn't know about it. Didn't know that their supposedly struggling daughter owned 2 properties in Chicago and had a retirement account that many 40-year-olds would envy. And I'd kept all of this hidden because somewhere along the way, I'd learned that my achievements only made them uncomfortable, only highlighted the fact that I'd succeeded without their support or approval, or even their basic acknowledgement that what I did was real work. I sat down at my desk, still wearing the dress I'd worn to the party, and I realized with a clarity that felt almost physical that hiding my success had been a form of protection, yes, but it had also enabled their mistreatment, had allowed them to continue seeing me as the family failure because I'd never contradicted that narrative, had never stood up and said, "Actually, I'm doing better than you think, better than maybe any of you realized, and maybe it's time you stop treating me like I'm still the disappointing daughter who couldn't measure up to Marcus's corporate job and 6-figure salary that, if I was being honest, probably wasn't much more than I made, and might even be less." The text from Marcus started 2 days after the engagement party. A simple message that appeared on my phone while I was in the middle of a client call. "Hey, just following up on the honeymoon contribution. When do you think you can get me that money?" And I stared at it for a long moment before setting my phone face down on my desk and returning to my conversation about brand identity systems. And I didn't respond to that first message or to the second one that came 3 days later. This one's slightly less friendly. "Emma, need to know about the $6,500. We're booking things and need final numbers." And when I continued not responding, Marcus's texts became more frequent and more aggressive, first every few days and then daily. Messages that said things like, "Are you seriously going to ignore me about this?" And "I don't understand why you're being so difficult." And finally, a week and a half after the party, "Are you really going to be this selfish?" Which made my stomach clench with that familiar combination of guilt and anger. Guilt because years of conditioning had taught me that saying no to family made me a bad person. Anger because Marcus apparently saw nothing wrong with demanding thousands of dollars from someone he'd publicly humiliated. My parents started calling too, Mom first with her gentle but pointed voice, asking if I'd thought about what Marcus asked, and saying it would mean so much to him if I could find a way to help. And when I said I really couldn't afford it, she made a soft, disappointed sound and said, "Emma, I know you're careful with money, but this is family, and sometimes we make sacrifices for the people we love." Which would have been a more compelling argument if anyone in my family had ever made a sacrifice for me, if they'd ever put my needs or feelings ahead of Marcus's wants. Dad called a few days later with a different approach, his lawyer voice in full effect, as he explained that family obligations sometimes required us to stretch beyond our comfort zone, and that he and Mom had always been there for both Marcus and me, which was such a selective memory of my childhood that I almost laughed, except I was too tired to find anything about this situation funny anymore. I let their calls go to voicemail more often than not, sent brief texts saying I was busy with work, which was actually true because in the midst of this family drama, I'd landed the biggest client of my career, a national retail chain that wanted a complete rebrand, everything from logo design to packaging to website interface, an $85,000 contract for a year-long project that I'd celebrated by taking my business partner and closest friend Jade out for an expensive dinner where I'd finally broken down and told her everything about Marcus's demand and the engagement party humiliation. Jade, who'd known me since college and who'd watched me build my business from nothing, had been furious on my behalf, had said, "Emma, you need to tell them the truth. You need to stop letting them treat you like this." But I'd shaken my head and said I couldn't, didn't know how to undo decades of family dynamics, didn't know how to suddenly announce that I'd been successful all along. And Jade had reached across the table and grabbed my hand and said, "Then at least stand up for yourself. Tell Marcus no. Tell your parents no. Stop protecting people who don't protect you." And I'd promised I would think about it, even though thinking about it was all I'd been doing for weeks. The wedding was 2 months away now, and Marcus's texts had taken on a desperate quality that might have moved me if they'd contained any acknowledgement of how he'd treated me, any apology or recognition that demanding money while calling someone a broke loser wasn't exactly the best approach. But instead, he just kept pushing, kept insisting, and then one morning, I woke up to a Venmo request on my phone, $6,500 with a note that said, "Family contribution. Thanks, sis." Like it was already a done deal, like my agreement had never been in question, and I stared at that request for a long time before declining it, and finally, feeling something harden in my chest. Some final thread of obligation snapping under the weight of his entitlement. Marcus called me 1 month before the wedding, and I knew from the ringtone cutting through my apartment at 8:30 on a Tuesday evening that this conversation wasn't going to be pleasant, but I answered anyway because some part of me still hadn't learned that I didn't owe him my availability, and his voice came through the phone tight with anger, no greeting or preamble before he said, "Emma, what the hell is going on with the money I asked you for?" And I felt my stomach clench with that familiar dread, even as I tried to keep my voice steady and calm. "Marcus, I can't afford to give you $6,500, I said, and the words felt both liberating and terrifying coming out of my mouth. The first time I'd given him a direct answer instead of deflecting or avoiding, and the silence on the other end of the line stretched for 3 long seconds before he exploded in a way that shouldn't have shocked me, but somehow still did. "You're so pathetic," he said, his voice rising with each word, and I could picture him pacing in the apartment he shared with Ashley, the nice 2-bedroom in River North, with the floor-to-ceiling windows that he'd made sure to show me when they first moved in, and he continued, "You make what, 30,000 a year with your little hobby? Maybe 35 if you're lucky? You could save up if you actually tried, if you didn't waste money on whatever you wasted on. But no, broke loser. Emma can't help her own brother on his wedding. Can't do one decent thing for family because you're too selfish and too cheap and honestly too pathetic to understand what family means." I held the phone away from my ear slightly, his words washing over me like they had my entire life, insults and dismissals and cruel assessments of my worth that I'd absorbed and internalized until I'd almost believed them myself, almost convinced myself that yes, I was the failure, I was the disappointment, I was the one who didn't measure up, but something was different now. Something had shifted in me during those weeks of his demanding texts and my parents' disappointed calls, and I found myself listening to his tirade with a strange detachment, hearing his words but not feeling them land the way they once would have. "Mom and Dad are so disappointed in you," Marcus continued, and I could hear Ashley's voice in the background asking what was wrong, and he said, "They've done everything for you, supported you through your weird art phase in college, never pushed you to get a real job even though they probably should have, and this is how you repay them? By refusing to help your only brother?" And I waited until he paused for breath before I said quietly, "I'm sorry you feel that way, Marcus." Which was not an apology for my decision, but rather an acknowledgement that his feelings were his own, and I couldn't control them, wouldn't try to manage them anymore the way I'd spent years trying to manage everyone's perception of me. "Sorry I feel this way," he repeated, his voice incredulous now, moving past anger into something that sounded almost like genuine confusion that I wasn't crumbling under his assault. And he said, "Emma, if you don't come through with this money, maybe you shouldn't bother coming to the wedding at all. Maybe we don't need someone there who clearly doesn't care about family." And that threat, which would have devastated me even a month ago, settled over me like confirmation of something I'd already known. And I said, "If that's what you want, Marcus, I understand." And after a few more minutes of him blustering and me refusing to engage, we ended the call, and I sat on my couch in the quiet of my apartment and realized with perfect clarity that I was done. Done protecting his ego, done hiding my success, done pretending that their version of me was the truth, and I opened my laptop and began planning exactly what I was going to say when the moment came. The wedding week arrived with a cold front that swept through Chicago in early June, unseasonably chilly weather that matched the frigid treatment I received from my family. And Marcus hadn't officially uninvited me despite his threat, but the silence from everyone made it clear I was attending under protest, tolerated rather than welcomed. And I decided I would go anyway because something in me needed to see this through, needed to be present for what I now understood would be a reckoning of some kind, even if I didn't yet know exactly what form it would take. The day before the wedding, I was reviewing mock-ups for the retail chain rebranding project when my mother called, and her voice had a strange quality I couldn't immediately identify, something brittle and anxious that made me sit up straighter at my desk. And she said, "Emma, something's happened. Marcus lost his job yesterday. The whole department was eliminated, company downsizing, and he's devastated but trying to hold it together for the wedding." And I felt a complicated rush of emotions, sympathy for what that must feel like mixed with a dark satisfaction that his corporate title, the thing he'd lorded over me for years, had proven just as unstable as he'd always claimed my freelance work was. "That's terrible, Mom," I said, and I meant it despite everything because losing a job was genuinely awful. But then she continued in a voice that told me the real reason for her call, saying, "He's trying to keep it quiet, doesn't want Ashley's family to know yet, doesn't want to ruin the wedding, and Emma, I know things have been tense, but this seems like a time when family should come together. And if you could find it in your heart to help with that money he asked for, it would mean so much right now. He's going through such a hard time." And the audacity of it, the sheer impossibility of her request, left me speechless for several seconds before I said quietly, "Mom, my answer is still no." And her voice turned cold in a way I'd heard directed at me many times before as she said, "You're being cruel, Emma. Your brother is struggling and you're punishing him because of some perceived slight." And I wanted to laugh at perceived slight as a description for years of verbal abuse. But instead, I just said, "I need to go. I'll see you at the rehearsal dinner tonight," and ended the call before she could guilt me further. The rehearsal dinner was held at an upscale Italian restaurant in the Loop, the private room decorated with white roses and gold accents, and I arrived exactly on time wearing a navy dress I'd bought specifically for these wedding events. Nice enough to be appropriate, but not so nice that anyone would question where I got the money. And Marcus didn't acknowledge my entrance at all, didn't look at me or greet me, just continued his conversation with Ashley's father about golf courses and investment portfolios, talking with the confident ease of someone who still had a job, still had the corporate credential that defined him. And I wondered if he'd told Ashley yet, if she knew that her new husband was unemployed, if that would have mattered to her or her family. I was seated at the far end of the table, physically separated from the main family group, placed between Ashley's teenage cousin, who spent the entire dinner on her phone, and an elderly aunt who was mostly deaf. And during the toasts, Ashley's father made pointed comments about the importance of family support during major life transitions, and being there for each other in meaningful ways, while looking directly at me. And I understood that my mother had told them about my refusal to contribute money, had probably painted me as the selfish sister who wouldn't help her struggling brother. And I sat there eating overpriced pasta and sipping wine and feeling the weight of their judgment, while also feeling something else, something harder and clearer, the absolute certainty that tomorrow everything was going to change. The wedding day dawned clear and beautiful, one of those perfect June Saturdays that seemed designed specifically for outdoor ceremonies. And the venue was the kind of place that appeared in bridal magazines, an elegant estate in Lake Forest, with manicured gardens and a ballroom with crystal chandeliers. The kind of location that probably cost more for one day than I paid in rent for 6 months. And I knew that Ashley's parents had covered most of the cost, with my parents contributing what they could from savings they'd mentioned were earmarked for this purpose. Their retirement fund diminished so Marcus could have the wedding he wanted, or rather the wedding Ashley wanted, and I arrived alone in my Honda Civic that looked distinctly out of place in the parking area filled with BMWs and Mercedes, and one actual Tesla, wearing a rose-colored dress I'd bought on sale, but that looked appropriate enough. And I made my way through the ceremony where I was seated in the fourth row despite being immediate family, watched Marcus and Ashley exchange vows that promised love and support and partnership, and felt nothing except a strange sense of detachment, like I was watching actors perform rather than my brother committing his life to someone. The reception began at 5 with cocktails in the garden, and I accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and stood near a decorative fountain, watching clusters of people laugh and talk. And I noticed how Ashley's family formed their own group, successful-looking people in expensive suits and designer dresses, and my parents hovered at the edges trying to fit in, trying to belong to this world that Marcus had married into. And when we moved inside for dinner, I found my assigned seat at a table near the back of the ballroom. Table 12 out of 15, seated with people I'd never met who turned out to be Ashley's coworkers from the marketing firm where she worked. Pleasant enough people who made polite conversation and asked what I did, and seemed genuinely interested when I said graphic design. One woman even asking for my card, which I provided. A small moment of professional recognition that felt almost jarring in this context, where I was used to being dismissed. Marcus gave his speech during dinner, standing at the head table with Ashley beside him, looking radiant in her $1,000 dress. And he thanked everyone who had supported them, talked about how blessed they were to have family and friends who really showed up for them in meaningful ways. And when he said meaningful ways, his eyes swept across the room and deliberately skipped over me. And several people at my table noticed. I could tell from the uncomfortable glances they exchanged. And I felt my anger building in a way it hadn't before, something hot and solid forming in my chest. Then came the money dance portion of the reception, that traditional moment where guests could pay for a dance with the bride or groom, and the money would go toward their honeymoon or future together. And I watched as Ashley's relatives lined up with envelopes and cards, and they made a show of it, announcing amounts as they handed them over, Ashley's uncle declaring loudly that his check was for $5,000, her aunt counter-offering with $3,000, and my parents approached with their envelope, which Marcus opened and showed to Ashley, not announcing the amount, but nodding with satisfaction. And I stayed at my table, stayed in my seat at the back of the room, and I saw Marcus notice my absence from the line, saw him say something to Ashley, who looked over at me and smiled in that particular way that communicated exactly what she thought of me. And I knew what was coming before he even reached for the microphone again, knew that this moment I'd been simultaneously dreading and preparing for was finally here. Marcus stepped away from Ashley and reached for the microphone again, and the DJ lowered the music slightly as my brother's voice filled the ballroom with that particular tone of performative cheerfulness that I'd learned to recognize as preceding something cruel, and he said, "Before we continue, I just want to acknowledge someone special, my little sister Emma." And every head in the room turned toward me at table 12, and I felt my heart start to pound as he continued. "Emma, my dear sister, I notice you haven't participated in our money dance yet, and I'm sure it's just an oversight, so I wanted to give you a chance. Are you going to contribute anything to help your brother and his new wife, or are you too broke?" And the last two words landed like a slap across the room, and there was uncomfortable laughter from some guests who thought this was sibling banter, normal teasing. But others shifted in their seats, recognizing the edge of cruelty in his voice, and Ashley was smirking beside him, her hand on his arm, and my parents were at their table looking at me with expressions that pleaded for me to just go along, just laugh it off, just maintain the family peace the way I always had. And something in me that had been coiling tighter and tighter throughout this entire evening, throughout these entire months, throughout my entire life, finally snapped into clarity and purpose. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the floor in the sudden quiet, and I picked up my purse and walked toward the head table, and the distance felt both endless and too short, every step taking me closer to a moment I couldn't take back. And I was aware of everyone watching me. 150 guests tracking my movement across the ballroom, and when I reached Marcus and Ashley, I opened my purse and pulled out the envelope I'd prepared 3 days ago, when I'd finally decided exactly how this was going to end, and I said in a voice that sounded steadier than I felt, "I do have something for you, Marcus." And his face split into a triumphant smirk as he reached for the envelope, vindicated in front of all these witnesses, and Ashley actually clapped her hands together once in delight, and I pulled the envelope back slightly and said, "But first, I want to say something." And I reached for the microphone before he could object, and he was so surprised that he actually let me take it, and I turned to face the room full of people, and my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. But my hands were steady as I brought the microphone to my lips, and I thought about every time he'd called me a loser, every time my work had been dismissed, every time I'd made myself smaller to protect his ego, and I began speaking. "Most of you don't know me very well. I'm Marcus's younger sister, Emma, and I want to thank you all for coming to celebrate this beautiful wedding," I started, and my voice sounded strange to me, amplified through the sound system. And I saw my mother start to stand up, and my father put his hand on her arm to stop her. And I continued before I could lose my nerve. My brother called me a broke loser in front of his friends at his engagement party 3 months ago, and honestly, it wasn't the first time. He's been calling me some version of that my entire adult life, and a few minutes after he called me that, he asked me to contribute $6,500 toward his honeymoon. And there were audible gasps throughout the room, and I saw Ashley's mother's mouth fall open, and Marcus's face was turning red as he realized I wasn't giving a sweet sister of the groom toast, and he reached for the microphone, but I stepped back, still speaking. "You assumed I couldn't afford to help you? That was your entire basis for demanding money from me while insulting me. You just assume that because I'm a freelance graphic designer working from home, instead of sitting in a corporate office, that I must be barely scraping by," I said into the microphone. And my voice was getting stronger now, feeding off the shocked silence in the room, and I continued. "The truth is, Marcus, I could have written you a check for $6,500 easily. I could have written you a check for the entire $15,000 for your honeymoon and not even noticed it missing from my account." And the gasps were louder now, and I saw Ashley's father lean forward in his seat with sudden interest, and my mother's hand was over her mouth, and Marcus was shaking his head like I was lying, like this was some desperate fantasy I was spinning, and I pulled out my phone with my free hand, opened my banking app, and turned the screen toward the guests at the nearest tables, and I watched their expressions change from skepticism to shock as they saw the balance displayed there. $183,412 in my business savings account, and I said, "That's just one account. I have others. And I own an investment property in Logan Square that I bought last year." And the murmurs were spreading through the ballroom now like ripples in water, people turning to their neighbors and whispering. And I handed my phone to Ashley's aunt, who was sitting closest, and she looked at it, and her eyes went wide, and she passed it to the person next to her. And my phone made its way through several hands while I kept speaking, and I said, "My freelance graphic design business that you've all dismissed as not real work and computer stuff, and my little hobby actually generates between $12,000 and $15,000 monthly. I have 3 major corporate clients and just signed an $85,000 year-long contract with a tech company in San Francisco. I employ 2 part-time contractors. And I'm on track to break $200,000 in revenue this year." And I could see my father doing math in his head, see the realization hitting him, and Marcus was standing now, his face bright red, and he said, "You're lying, there's no way." But his voice was weak, uncertain. And Ashley looked between me and Marcus with confusion replacing her earlier smugness, and I continued, "I'm not broke, Marcus. I'm actually doing better financially than most people in this room, probably including you." And that last part landed with particular weight, because some people here knew, I could tell from their expressions, that Marcus had lost his job just yesterday, and I said, "I've been hiding my success from our family for years, because every time I accomplished something, every time I was proud of my work, you made me feel stupid for not having a real job like yours. You made me feel less than. You convinced me that my path was somehow inferior to your corporate career. And I believed you. I internalized that shame so deeply that I kept my achievements secret because I thought they didn't matter. I thought they weren't enough. And my voice cracked slightly on those last words, the genuine hurt breaking through my steady delivery, and I saw some people in the audience nodding, particularly some of the women, and one of Ashley's bridesmaids had tears in her eyes. And I took a breath and steadied myself and said, "But my work does matter. My success is real, and I'm not going to hide it anymore just to protect your ego." "But here's what really matters," I continued, my voice steadier now, finding its rhythm. "You never asked about my life. Marcus, not once in the past 5 years have you asked me about my work with genuine interest. You never respected what I do. You just assumed I was failing because I don't wear a suit to an office, because I work from my apartment instead of a downtown high-rise, because I chose a creative path instead of your corporate trajectory, and that assumption says everything about you and nothing about me." And I turned to look directly at him, and his face was bright red now, a vein pulsing in his temple, and I said what I'd learned just yesterday from my mother's panicked phone call. "Marcus, you lost your job on Friday, your company downsized, and you were let go, and I'm genuinely sorry about that. I know how scary and destabilizing that must feel." And the room erupted in gasps and whispers, because clearly most of these guests hadn't known. Ashley's family certainly hadn't known based on her mother's sharp intake of breath, and Marcus's eyes went wide with betrayal and rage, and I continued before he could interrupt. "But maybe now you'll understand that corporate titles don't define worth, that job security isn't guaranteed no matter how superior you feel, that the real job you've held over my head for years can disappear in a single meeting with HR." And my voice wasn't cruel when I said this. I wasn't gloating. I was simply stating a truth that he needed to hear. And Marcus suddenly lunged toward me, his hand reaching for the microphone, and he shouted, "How dare you! How dare you embarrass me at my wedding, you vindictive—" But Ashley's father stood up and said something sharp to Marcus that I couldn't quite hear, and Marcus stopped mid-sentence, breathing hard. And I said into the microphone, "You've embarrassed me my entire life, Marcus. You called me names in front of your friends. You demanded money from me while insulting me. You've made me feel worthless and stupid and less than for years. And I'm done. I'm done shrinking myself to make you feel bigger. I'm done hiding my success to protect your fragile ego. I'm done pretending that your cruelty is just brotherly teasing." And tears were streaming down my face now, but my voice wasn't wavering, and I reached into the envelope I'd been holding and pulled out the single piece of paper inside, and I handed it to Marcus. And he opened it with shaking hands while I said, "That's what you deserve from someone you've treated like garbage. Nothing." And he stared at the paper which contained just one sentence in my handwriting. "I hope your marriage is filled with more kindness than you've ever shown me." And the envelope was empty. No check, no cash, nothing but those words, and Ashley made a sound that was half sob, half gasp. And she looked at the paper over Marcus's shoulder and then at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. And my mother was standing now, her face pale, and she said, "Emma, please, this isn't the time." And I looked at her and said into the microphone so everyone could hear, "When was the time, Mom? When should I have said something? When he called me a broke loser at his engagement party? When you asked me to just be reasonable and give him money? When you introduced me to Ashley's family as doing some computer stuff, like my work was too insignificant to even name? When was I supposed to matter?" And my mother's face crumpled, and I saw actual recognition there, actual understanding breaking through. And my father had his head in his hands, and I gently set the microphone down on the head table, and the room was completely silent, except for the sound of someone crying. And I turned and walked toward the exit, and my legs were shaking, but I kept moving. And behind me, I heard Marcus start to yell something, but Ashley's father's voice cut him off, and I pushed through the ballroom doors into the hotel corridor, and the sounds of the reception faded behind me. I made it halfway across the lobby before I heard the ballroom doors burst open behind me, and I turned to see Marcus storming after me, his face purple with rage, and he was shouting, "You bitch! You complete bitch! How dare you humiliate me like that in front of everyone?" And hotel staff were starting to notice. A concierge looked alarmed, and I just stood there and let him yell because I had nothing left to say to him. I had said everything that mattered, and then Ashley appeared in the doorway behind him, mascara streaking down her face, and she called out, "Marcus, stop, just stop!" But he ignored her, and he got right up in my face and hissed, "You're dead to me. You understand? You're not my sister anymore." And I felt nothing when he said it, just a strange, hollow relief, and I said quietly, "I haven't really been your sister for a long time, Marcus. You made sure of that." And I turned and walked toward the exit, and behind me I heard my mother's voice. She had followed them out, and she was saying, "Emma, Emma, wait, please." And I paused at the hotel's front door and turned back to see both my parents hurrying across the lobby, and my mother reached me first, breathless, and she said, "How could you do that? How could you ruin his wedding day?" And the words hit me like they always had, that automatic assumption that I was the problem, that I was the one who had done something wrong. And I looked at her and said, "I didn't ruin anything. I just stopped pretending. I stopped hiding who I am to make him feel superior." And my father reached us then, and his face was different than I expected. Not angry, but stunned, processing, and he said, "Emma, is it true, what you said in there, about your business, about the money?" And I nodded, and he said, "Why didn't you tell us?" And I laughed, a short, bitter sound, and said, "Because every time I tried to talk about my work, you changed the subject, or made a dismissive comment, or compared me unfavorably to Marcus, so I stopped trying." And my mother opened her mouth to protest, but then closed it again. And I could see her actually thinking back, actually remembering, and her face changed. And I didn't wait for whatever she was going to say. I just pushed through the door into the cool evening air, and I was walking toward the parking garage when I heard voices behind me, not my family this time, and I turned to see 3 people from the wedding, and I recognized Ashley's aunt, the one who had seen my phone first, and 2 younger women who had been seated at one of the middle tables, and Ashley's aunt said, "I'm sorry to chase you down, but I wanted to say that took remarkable courage." And she handed me a business card and said, "I run a marketing firm. We're always looking for talented designers. I'd love to talk to you about some contract work." And one of the younger women said, "I'm Ashley's college roommate, and honestly, someone needed to say something. The way they talked about you all night was horrible." And she asked for my business card, said her company was rebranding and needed design help, and I stood there in the parking garage giving out business cards, still wearing my cocktail dress with tears drying on my face. And it was surreal and perfect and terrible all at once. And after they left, I got to my car and sat in the driver's seat, and my whole body started shaking, adrenaline finally releasing, and I pulled out my phone and saw 17 texts from Jade because I had texted her right before taking the microphone, just 3 words, "I'm doing it." And she had responded with a string of increasingly excited messages, and I called her, and when she answered, she was screaming, oh my God, tell me everything." And I started laughing and crying at the same time, and I drove home while telling her the whole story on speakerphone, and she kept saying, "I'm so proud of you, Emma. I'm so fucking proud of you." And when I got to my apartment, I felt completely drained, but also lighter than I had in years, like I had been carrying something impossibly heavy and had finally set it down. And I thought about Marcus ordering me to leave, saying I was dead to him, and I realized that I was okay with that, more than okay. I was relieved, because years of emotional abuse had just ended in one moment of truth. The first 48 hours after the wedding were brutal in a way I hadn't anticipated, because my phone wouldn't stop ringing. First it was my mother at 7 in the morning the day after, her voice sharp and angry, saying, "Emma, what you did was unforgivable. You humiliated your brother on the most important day of his life. How could you be so selfish, so cruel?" And I let her talk. I didn't interrupt, and when she finally paused for breath, I said, "Mom, I need some space right now. I'm not ready to have this conversation." And she said, "Of course you're not ready. You never want to take responsibility for your actions." And I hung up, which I had never done before, and then my father called 2 hours later, and his voice was different, quieter, and he said, "Emma, your mother is very upset, But I need to ask you something. Was everything you said true about your business, about the money you're making? And I said, yes, Dad, all of it. And there was a long silence. And then he said, why didn't we know? Why didn't you tell us? And I felt something crack open in my chest. And I said, I tried. For years I tried. But every time I talked about my work, you changed the subject, or made a joke about my computer hobby, or compared me to Marcus. And eventually I just stopped trying. And I heard him take a shaky breath and he said, I need to think about this, and hung up. And then Marcus called from a number I didn't recognize, probably Ashley's phone since I'd blocked his number months ago. And when I answered by mistake, he screamed at me for 5 straight minutes, calling me every name he could think of, saying I had ruined his marriage before it even started, that Ashley's parents were horrified, that I was a vindictive bitch who couldn't stand to see him happy. And I listened to all of it, and then I said very calmly, Marcus, I hope someday you understand what you did to me, but either way, don't contact me again. And I blocked that number too, and then I turned off my phone completely and spent the rest of Sunday in my apartment with Jade, who brought wine and takeout and let me cry and rage and process everything. And she kept saying, you did the right thing, you know that, right? You did exactly the right thing. And I wanted to believe her, but I also felt guilty and terrible and exhilarated all at the same time. And Monday I had to turn my phone back on for work. And there were 63 messages, most from extended family members who had heard about the wedding drama. Some supportive, many critical, and I deleted them all without reading most of them. But there was also an email from Ashley's Aunt Karen, the one who had given me her business card in the parking garage, and she had sent over a detailed brief for a project. She wanted me to redesign her company's entire brand identity, and she wrote, I meant what I said about your courage, and after looking at your portfolio online, I'm even more impressed. Please send me a quote for this work. And I sat there staring at that email for 10 minutes, and then I drafted a proposal for $50,000, which was actually slightly under my normal rate for that scope of work, and I sent it before I could second-guess myself, and she accepted it within 2 hours. And suddenly, I had half a year's salary secured from a wedding where I'd been called a broke loser. And the irony wasn't lost on me. And over the following weeks, my parents started calling more regularly, and the tone began to shift. My mother still defensive at first, but gradually, incrementally, starting to acknowledge things, saying, I suppose we didn't always listen when you talked about your work, which wasn't quite an apology, but was more than I'd expected. And my father actually asked me to coffee 3 weeks after the wedding, and we sat in a Starbucks and he said, I've been thinking about what you said, about us never taking you seriously, and your mother and I talked, really talked, and Emma, I think we owe you an apology. And his eyes were wet, and I realized this was the first time I'd ever seen my father cry, and he said, we were so focused on Marcus, on his traditional career path, on things we understood, that we completely missed what you were building, and more than that, we made you feel like you didn't matter, and I'm ashamed of that. And I cried too, sitting there in Starbucks with my coffee getting cold, and I said, I need things to be different now. I need you to respect my choices, even if you don't understand them. I need you to stop comparing me to Marcus. I need to be seen as my own person. And he nodded and said, I understand, and we'll try. I promise we'll try. And it wasn't perfect. Our relationship didn't magically heal, but it was a beginning. And I started having dinner with my parents once every few weeks. And slowly, carefully, we began building something new with actual boundaries and mutual respect. And Marcus, for his part, went completely silent. I heard nothing from him directly, though my mother mentioned once that he and Ashley were adjusting to his new job, which I understood to mean they were struggling financially since his new position paid 40% less than his previous one, and I felt a complicated mix of sympathy and vindication, and I didn't reach out because I knew he wasn't ready, and honestly neither was I. And then 6 months after the wedding, on a random Tuesday afternoon, I got a text from Marcus's number. Just one sentence. You were right to say no. And I stared at that message for a long time. And it wasn't an apology. Not really, but it was an acknowledgement, an admission that maybe I hadn't been the villain in our story. And I didn't respond because I didn't need to. That message was for him more than for me. And meanwhile, my business continued to grow. I hired 2 contractors to help with overflow work. I moved to a larger apartment with dedicated office space. I bought a new car, not because I needed one, but because I wanted one, and I could afford it. And I started dating someone I met through a client, a photographer named David, who asked about my work with genuine interest and listened to my answers, and never once made me feel like my career was less legitimate than his. And when I introduced him to my parents after 3 months, my mother didn't describe my work as computer stuff. She actually said, "Emma runs a very successful graphic design business." And that small shift meant more than she probably realized. And I kept working with Ashley's Aunt Karen, and that initial project led to 3 more, and she introduced me to other business owners in her network. And my annual revenue hit $400,000, and I bought a second investment property, and I started a retirement account, and I hired a financial advisor, and I did all of this openly, posting about my wins on social media, talking about my business at family dinners, no longer hiding my success to make other people comfortable. And the strangest thing was how much lighter I felt, how much energy I'd been spending on maintaining that false image of struggle. And I realized that hiding my success hadn't protected me from their judgment. It had just made me smaller, had compressed me into a shape they found acceptable. And now I was finally taking up the space I deserved. And I gathered around me people who celebrated that rather than resented it. Jade and David and my contractors and my clients, and a whole network of fellow freelancers I met through online communities. And these people saw my value not because I proved it through bank statements, but because they respected the work itself. And 7 months after the wedding, I got an email from a company I'd been following for years, a design firm in New York that worked with major international brands. And they wanted to talk to me about a creative director position, and I took the call even though I wasn't sure I wanted to leave freelancing. And the conversation went so well that they flew me to New York. And I spent 3 days meeting with their team and touring their office and imagining that life. And ultimately, I turned down the job because I realized I loved the freedom of running my own business. But the fact that I had been offered it, that they had sought me out based on my portfolio and reputation, felt like a validation I hadn't known I needed. And when I told my parents about turning down a $200,000 salary to continue freelancing, my mother didn't question it. She just said, "You've built something remarkable, Emma, and I'm proud of you." And I cried when she said that, because I'd waited 28 years to hear those words. And I thought about Marcus and that wedding, and the microphone shaking in my hand, and the moment I decided to stop being small. And I realized that confrontation had freed me not just from Marcus's cruelty, but from my own fear of being seen. And yes, it had cost me a relationship with my brother, at least for now, but it had given me back myself. And that trade was worth it. And on the 1 year anniversary of Marcus's wedding, I was signing a contract with a dream client, a sustainable fashion brand that wanted me to develop their entire visual identity from scratch. A 6 month project worth $90,000, and I celebrated with Jade and David at a nice restaurant, the kind of place I used to think was too expensive for someone like me, and Jade raised her glass and said, "To Emma," who finally stopped hiding her light. And David kissed my cheek and said, "To the most talented designer I know, who also happens to be the bravest person I've ever met." And I thought about that word, brave, and realized that bravery wasn't the absence of fear. It was choosing authenticity even when it cost you something. And I had lost my brother and nearly lost my parents and caused a scene at a wedding. But I had gained myself, my whole entire self, and sitting there with people who truly saw me and valued me, I felt a peace I had never experienced in my family home growing up, and I realized that my worth had never been determined by Marcus's recognition or my parents' approval. My worth had always existed independent of their acknowledgement. I just finally believed it, and that belief changed everything.